A little servant was buried alive under ice and dirt. The Apache warrior dug her out bare-handed and rode her to safety. Arizona Territory, winter of 1879. The wind screamed across the high desert like a wounded animal, tearing through the canyon walls with a fury that seemed almost personal. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, burying the rocky terrain under a blanket of white that stretched endlessly in every direction. The temperature had plummeted with nightfall, and now the air itself felt sharp enough to cut skin. Junipers bent under the weight of ice, their branches groaning and snapping in the gale. The landscape had transformed into something alien and hostile, a place where life struggled to maintain its fragile hold. In a shallow ravine where twisted juniper trees clung to life among the rocks, a small mound of earth and ice lay freshly disturbed. The ground had been clawed open, then hastily filled again, packed tight with frozen soil and chunks of ice from a nearby stream. The surface was smooth, except for one spot where the snow had been brushed away, revealing a patch of disturbed earth no larger than a dinner plate. Boot prints surrounded the mound, already half filled with new snow, evidence of men who had worked quickly and without care. Beneath that patch, 6 feet down in the frozen ground, was a child. Her name was Coraline, and she was 7 years old. Her fingers were bloody from clawing at the wooden crate they had shoved her into before burying it. The air inside was thick and stale, each breath harder to draw than the last. Her dress, a plain gray cotton servant's uniform 2 sizes too large, was torn at the shoulders where rough hands had dragged her from the ranch house. The fabric was stiff with cold, offering no protection against the freezing temperature that seeped through the wood. Her bare feet had lost all feeling hours ago, the thin stockings she wore doing nothing to keep out the deadly chill. She had stopped screaming hours ago. Her throat was raw, her voice nothing more than a hoarse whisper that disappeared into the suffocating darkness. The cold had seeped through the thin walls of the crate, through her dress, through her skin, settling deep in her bones. Her lips had turned blue, her small body shaking with violent tremors she could no longer control. Ice crystals had formed in her blonde hair, glittering in the absolute darkness like cruel stars. Around her neck hung a tarnished silver chain with a small locket, the only thing she owned that had belonged to her mother. Inside the locket was a tiny lock of brown hair and a faded photograph of a woman Coraline barely remembered. The image was worn nearly smooth from years of her small fingers tracing the beloved face. Her mother had died when Coraline was 3, leaving her with nothing but this locket and memories that grew hazier with each passing year. Her fingers found the locket in the darkness, clutching it as though it might somehow pull her back to a time when she had not been alone. When someone had loved her, the ranch hands had laughed as they buried her. She remembered their voices, slurred with whiskey, echoing down through the dirt as they shoveled. One of them had said she knew too much, that little ears heard too many secrets. Another had said it was a mercy, that she would freeze before she suffocated, that it would be quick and painless. A third had simply grunted with each shovelful, as though burying a child alive was no different than any other day's work. Their laughter had been the last human sound she heard before the final layer of earth sealed her in complete darkness. Coraline's thoughts drifted in and out of coherence, slipping between memory and delirium. She thought of the kitchen where she had worked since she was 5, scrubbing pots until her hands bled, carrying water from the well in buckets so heavy she could barely lift them. She thought of the head housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, a severe woman with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint, who had caught her listening at the study door 3 nights ago. She thought of the men in that study, their voices low and urgent as they discussed the silver mine. The missing payroll, the foreman who asked too many questions, the accusations that would surely come she had not meant to hear. She had only been returning a forgotten oil lamp to the hallway, moving quietly as servants were taught to do, making herself invisible. But Mrs. Dalton had seen her there, had seen the recognition in Coraline's wide eyes when one of the men mentioned killing the foreman to cover their tracks. making it look like an accident in the mine shaft. The next morning, Mrs. Dalton had told the ranch owner that Coraline had stolen bread from the kitchen, a lie delivered with such conviction that no one questioned it. The punishment, she said, should be severe. The ranch owner had nodded, turned away, and given Mrs. Dalton permission to handle the matter as she saw fit. Now Coraline lay in the frozen earth, her small chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps. The darkness around her was absolute, pressing in from all sides like a living thing with weight and substance. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, each thump a little weaker than the last, the rhythm becoming irregular. Her fingers had gone numb, no longer responding to her commands. The locket slipped from her grasp, falling against her chest with a soft sound she could barely hear over the roaring in her ears. She thought of stories her mother used to tell, of angels who watched over children, of heaven being a warm place full of light. She wondered if her mother was there, waiting. The thought brought a strange comfort, a loosening of the fear that had gripped her since the moment the crate lid had been nailed shut. Perhaps dying would not be so terrible. Perhaps it would be like falling asleep and waking somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere she was not alone. Above ground, the storm raged on with no sign of abating. Snow piled higher over the disturbed earth, erasing the evidence of what had been done. The wind howled through the ravine, drowning out any sound that might have escaped from below. The world moved on, indifferent to the small life fading beneath its surface. Night creatures huddled in their dens. The stars, if they shone at all, were hidden behind thick clouds that promised more snow before dawn. Then, through the howling wind and driving snow, came the sound of hoofbeats. A lone rider appeared at the mouth of the ravine, his silhouette dark against the white curtain of the storm. He sat tall in the saddle, wrapped in a heavy blanket that whipped behind him like wings. His horse, a sturdy paint mare with a thick winter coat of brown and white patches, picked its way carefully through the deep snow, ears swiveling forward as though searching for something. Steam rose from the animal's nostrils with each breath, dissipating instantly in the frigid air. The rider's name was Daklugi, and he was Apache. His face was weathered and angular, with high cheekbones and eyes as black as obsidian that missed nothing. Long hair, streaked with silver despite his relative youth of perhaps 35 years, hung past his shoulders in a single thick braid wrapped with leather cord. Across his back, he carried a rifle wrapped in oiled canvas to protect it from the weather. At his belt hung a knife with a bone handle, worn smooth from years of use, and a medicine pouch made of deer hide decorated with intricate beadwork. He had been tracking a wounded elk for 2 days, following its blood trail through the high country. The animal had been shot by white hunters who left it to suffer rather than finishing what they started, a waste and cruelty that offended Daklugi's sense of proper respect for the hunt. The storm had erased the trail hours ago, but something had drawn him into this ravine, some instinct he could not name or explain. His people believed the land spoke to those who knew how to listen, that the spirits of the mountains and valleys sent messages to those with open hearts. Daklugi had learned to listen. He reined his horse to a stop and sat motionless, head tilted slightly as though straining to hear something beneath the wind. The mare snorted, stamping her hooves in the snow, her ears flicking back and forth nervously. Animals sense things humans could not, Daklugi knew. His horse was trying to tell him something. Daklugi's eyes swept across the ravine, taking in every detail with the trained observation of a tracker. The juniper trees bent under the weight of snow, branches scraping against rock. The rocks jutted from drifts like broken teeth, their dark surfaces slick with ice. And there, near the center of the ravine, a patch of ground that looked wrong. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots sinking into snow that reached his knees. He moved toward the disturbed earth with the careful, deliberate steps of a predator approaching prey, each footfall placed with precision to avoid hidden rocks or unstable ground beneath the snow. When he reached the spot, He knelt and brushed away the fresh snow with his hand. Beneath it, the earth was darker than the surrounding ground, packed tight but recently moved. Frost had not yet formed on its surface, the way it had on the undisturbed soil around it. Daklugi pressed his palm flat against the dirt. He closed his eyes and waited, shutting out the wind and cold, focusing all his attention on what his hand might tell him. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sensation of frozen earth against his skin. Then he felt it, a faint vibration against his palm, so weak it might have been his imagination or the tremor of his own pulse. But it came again, rhythmic and desperate, the unmistakable pattern of a heartbeat. Someone was alive down there. He stood and returned to his horse, pulling a small folding shovel from his saddlebag. The tool was meant for digging fire pits and clearing campsites, not excavating graves, but it was all he had. He drove the blade into the frozen earth with all his strength and began to dig. The ground resisted fiercely, hard as stone from weeks of freezing temperatures, each shovelful requiring every ounce of power in his shoulders and back. His breath came in clouds of white vapor that hung in the air before being torn away by the wind. Sweat froze on his forehead despite the cold, forming tiny crystals on his skin after 10 minutes of brutal work. The shovel struck something solid with a hollow thunk. Wood. Daklugi dropped to his knees and began clawing at the dirt with his bare hands, scraping away the frozen soil inch by painful inch. His fingers bled almost immediately, nails tearing against rocks and chunks of ice embedded in the earth. But he did not stop. Could not stop. The wood beneath revealed itself slowly. A crude pine crate barely large enough to hold a child, its boards rough and unsanded. He found the edge of the lid and wedged his fingers beneath it, splinters driving into his flesh as he pulled with all his strength. The wood groaned in protest, nails shrieking as they pulled free from the frame. The lid came away suddenly, and Daklugi fell backward into the snow, the wooden panel clutched in his hands. He threw it aside and scrambled forward on his knees, looking down into the crate. A small figure lay curled at the bottom, motionless as death itself. Blonde hair spread across her face in tangled strands matted with dirt and ice. Her skin was gray, the color of ash, lips blue-tinged and slightly parted. Her hands were drawn up to her chest, fingers curled into small fists, bloody from where she had clawed at the wood. For a terrible, heart-stopping moment, Daklugi thought he was too late, that whatever spark of life had called him to this place had been extinguished just before his arrival. Then her chest moved, a tiny stuttering breath that barely lifted her ribs. He reached down and lifted her from the crate, as gently as if she were made of glass, cradling her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp and cold as the grave she had been buried in, her limbs hanging loose and unresponsive. He could feel how fragile she was, all thin bones and delicate joints, a life that had never been given enough food or care. He carried her to his horse with quick, purposeful strides, his mind already planning the next steps. With one hand, he pulled the heavy blanket from his shoulders, ignoring the immediate bite of cold against his own body, and wrapped it around her small form, tucking it tight to trap what little warmth remained. Coraline's eyelids fluttered, but did not open. A faint whimper escaped her lips, a sound so broken and pitiful it made Daklugi's jaw tighten with anger at whoever had done this. He secured her against his chest with a leather strap, tying her in place so she would not fall if she lost consciousness completely, then swung into the saddle behind her. The paint mare shifted under the added weight, but held steady, well-trained and reliable even in the worst conditions. Daklugi turned the horse away from the ravine and urged her into a careful trot, as fast as he dared given the treacherous footing and the precious cargo he carried. The storm was worsening by the minute, visibility dropping to mere feet ahead. He needed shelter immediately, a place to build a fire and assess the child's condition properly, somewhere defensible in case whoever had buried her came looking. His mind raced through the terrain he knew intimately from years of hunting and traveling through this country, searching for options. There was a cave system 2 miles north, carved into the base of a red rock mesa by centuries of wind and water. It would be defensible, dry, and out of the wind. He had used it before during harsh weather. He pressed his heels gently to the mare's flanks, and she responded immediately, picking up her pace as much as the deep snow allowed. Coraline hung against his chest, her shallow breathing the only sign she still lived, each exhalation a tiny cloud of warmth against his shirt. Daklugi kept one arm wrapped firmly around her, holding her secure against the jolting gate, while his other hand gripped the reins. His eyes scanned the darkness ahead constantly, searching for landmarks only he could recognize in this white chaos. Reading the land the way others read books, the ride took nearly an hour. Each minute an eternity of cold and uncertainty. The temperature continued to drop, the kind of cold that killed quickly if you were not prepared. Daklugi's hands ached, his fingers stiff inside his gloves. The cold bit through his shirt now that he had given up his blanket, but he barely felt it. His focus was entirely on the small, fragile life he carried. He spoke to her in Apache. Low words meant more to reassure himself than her. Prayers to the mountain spirits to guide them safely. To keep this child's spirit from slipping away into the darkness before he could get her warm. When the mesa finally emerged from the storm like a great shadow looming against the sky, Daklugi felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful. He guided the mare to the base of the cliff face where the wind was less fierce, blocked partially by the massive rock formation. He dismounted carefully, untying Coraline and lifting her down with infinite care. The cave entrance was narrow and easily missed, hidden behind a fallen boulder that looked like part of the natural cliff face, but he knew it well. He had sheltered here many times during his years of tracking and hunting in this country. Inside, the cave opened into a larger chamber, the air still and remarkably warmer than outside, insulated by layers of rock from the killing cold. Daklugi laid Coraline on a flat section of stone near the back wall where the ground was driest, then quickly set about building a fire. He gathered dried wood he had stored here on previous visits, stacked carefully against the cave wall where it stayed dry and ready. He struck flint to steel over a nest of dry grass and bark shavings, sending sparks flying until one caught and began to smolder. He blew on it gently, nursing the tiny flame until it grew strong enough to ignite the kindling. The flames took hold slowly, then grew rapidly, casting dancing shadows across the cave walls and pushing back the darkness. With the fire burning steadily and beginning to throw real heat, Daklugi turned his full attention to the child. He knelt beside her and carefully unwrapped the blanket, examining her with the practiced eye of someone who had treated injuries in the field many times, who had seen what cold and violence could do to a human body. Her fingers and toes were the color of old bruises, mottled purple and white, frostbitten, but perhaps not beyond saving if he acted quickly. The cuts on her hands from clawing at the crate were shallow but numerous, dirt packed into the wounds. More dirt caked her hair and face, mixed with blood from a cut on her forehead. But it was the bruises that made Daklugi's blood run cold despite years of witnessing cruelty. Dark marks encircled both her wrists where she had been bound with rope, the pattern of the weave still visible in her abraded skin. A handprint stood out starkly against her upper arm, the unmistakable impression of adult fingers gripping far too hard, hard enough to leave marks that would last for weeks. And around her throat, faint but visible in the firelight, was the shadow of a rope burn, as though someone had tried to strangle her before deciding burial would leave less obvious evidence. This child had not simply been buried. She had been beaten, bound, strangled, and left to die in the most cruel way imaginable. Daklugi's hands, so steady and sure moments before, trembled slightly as he reached for his medicine pouch with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. He pulled out a small clay jar sealed with beeswax, containing bear grease mixed with healing herbs his grandmother had taught him to prepare. He began carefully applying it to her frostbitten extremities, massaging gently to encourage blood flow without damaging the frozen tissue. Her feet were so small they fit entirely in his large, calloused palm, delicate as bird bones. As he worked with focused intensity, Coralia's eyes opened slightly. Just thin slits showing blue irises that were unfocused and glassy with shock and cold. She stared at him without recognition, without fear, without anything at all, her gaze empty in a way that was more disturbing than terror would have been. Her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear over the crackle of the fire. Daklugi leaned closer, bringing his ear near her mouth. "Please," she whispered, the word barely a breath of sound. "Please don't bury me again." Daklugi's throat tightened with an emotion he had not felt in years, not since he had buried his own daughter a decade ago. He placed one large, calloused hand gently on her forehead, a gesture of reassurance and protection. "You are safe now, little one," he said in English, his accent thick but his words clear and firm. "No one will bury you again. I give you my word, and I do not break my word." Her eyes drifted closed once more, but some of the terrible tension left her small body, her muscles relaxing slightly as though his promise had reached some part of her that still understood safety. Daklugi continued his work in silence, moving methodically through the tasks that needed doing. He cleaned her wounds with water heated over the fire, picking out dirt and debris with careful fingers. He wrapped her hands in soft cloth torn from his own shirt, binding them gently but securely. He covered her with every blanket and fur he possessed. Building layers of warmth around her fragile form, he heated water in a tin cup over the fire. Waiting until it was warm, but not hot enough to burn her damaged lips. He held it to her mouth, coaxing her to drink drop by drop, supporting her head with one hand while the other tilted the cup with infinite patience. Most of the water dribbled down her chin at first, but gradually she began to swallow, her body responding to the warmth and moisture even though she remained unconscious. Outside, the storm raged on through the night with unrelenting fury, wind howling like tortured spirits around the mesa. But inside the cave, firelight pushed back the darkness and cold, creating a small sanctuary of warmth and safety. Daklugi sat with his back against the stone wall, the child sleeping fitfully nearby, her breathing gradually becoming stronger and more regular. He wondered who had done this terrible thing, wondered why anyone would want to kill a child, and wondered what would happen when those responsible realized their victim had survived. He checked his rifle methodically, ensuring it was loaded and ready, then counted his ammunition. 23 rounds. It would have to be enough. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the familiar scrape of metal on stone calming his thoughts. Then he settled in to keep watch, knowing sleep was not an option tonight. Morning would bring answers, and likely trouble. But for now, in this moment, the child was warm and breathing and safe. That would have to be enough. Dawn broke pale and hesitant over the Arizona high desert, the storm finally exhausted after its night of fury. Thin shafts of silver light pierced through the cave entrance, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced in the still air. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm orange light across the stone chamber. Outside, the world lay silent under a fresh blanket of snow, the kind of profound quiet that comes only after nature has spent all its rage. Daklugi had not slept. He sat in the same position he had maintained throughout the night, his back against the cold stone wall, his rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. His body ached from hours of motionless vigilance, but he had learned long ago to ignore such discomforts. The child's breathing had grown steadier as the night progressed, the deadly rattle fading from her chest. Color had begun to return to her face, the deathly gray giving way to something closer to living flesh. Now as morning light crept across the cave floor, Coraline stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, blinking against the unfamiliar brightness. For several moments she lay perfectly still, her gaze moving across the rocky ceiling above her, taking in details her mind struggled to process. This was not the suffocating darkness of the wooden crate. This was not death. Confusion clouded her features as she tried to understand where she was and how she had arrived here. Her first attempt to sit up failed. Her arms trembled with weakness, refusing to support her weight. A soft whimper escaped her lips, equal parts frustration and fear. Daklugi rose smoothly from his position and crossed to her side, moving slowly so as not to startle her. He knelt beside her, keeping his hands visible and his movements gentle. "Easy, little one," he said quietly in English. "You are very weak. Your body needs time to heal." Coraline's eyes snapped to his face, truly seeing him for the first time. She took in his Apache features, his long braided hair, the weathered leather of his clothing. Her breath quickened, and for a moment Daklugi thought she might scream. He had seen that look before, the fear that white settlers carried in their hearts, the stories they told their children about savage Indians who stole and killed. He remained perfectly still, waiting for her to decide whether he was threat or salvation. But instead of screaming, Coraline's small hand reached up slowly and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw with a gentleness that spoke of wonder rather than fear. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse and barely audible. "You're real," she whispered. "I thought you were an angel. I thought I had died and gone to heaven." Daklugi's expression softened in a way it rarely did. He took her small hand in his much larger one, careful not to press on the bandages wrapping her damaged fingers. "I am not an angel," he said. "I am only a man. But you are alive and you are safe. That is what matters." Tears began to stream down Coraline's cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dirt still clinging to her skin. Her small body began to shake with sobs, all the terror and pain of the past days finally breaking through the shock that had protected her. Daklugi did not try to stop her tears or hush her crying. He understood that grief and fear needed release, that holding such things inside poisoned the spirit. Instead, he simply stayed beside her, his presence steady and calm, a solid anchor in her storm of emotion. When the sobs finally subsided into hiccuping breaths, Daklugi helped her sit up, supporting her back with one arm while using his free hand to arrange the furs and blankets behind her. He retrieved the tin cup of water, now cold but still clean, and held it to her lips. She drank greedily this time, her body recognizing its desperate need for fluid. "Slowly," Daklugi cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She obeyed, taking smaller sips, her eyes never leaving his face. When she had drunk her fill, she spoke again, her voice still rough but stronger than before. "They buried me," she said, the words coming out flat and emotionless, as though she were speaking of something that had happened to someone else. "Mrs. Dalton and the ranch hands. They put me in a box and buried me in the ground." I could hear them laughing. Daklugi's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "I know. I found you. I dug you out." Coraline looked down at her bandaged hands, at the blankets covering her, at the fire that had kept her warm through the night. Understanding dawned slowly in her young eyes. "You saved me," she said, not quite a question. "Why? You don't know me. I'm nobody. I'm just a servant." "You are not nobody," Daklugi said firmly. "You are a child, a living person with a spirit and a right to breathe. That is enough reason." She studied him for a long moment, her 7-year-old mind trying to reconcile what she had been taught about Indians with the reality of this man who had pulled her from death with his own bleeding hands. Finally, she asked the question that mattered most to her. "What's your name?" "Daklugi," he answered. "It means he stands alone in my language." "Daklugi," she repeated carefully, testing the unfamiliar syllables. Then, with the formal politeness beaten into servant children, she added, "My name is Coraline." "Coraline Webb, thank you for saving my life," he nodded once, acknowledging her gratitude, but clearly uncomfortable with it. He turned his attention to more practical matters, reaching into his provisions and pulling out strips of dried venison and a handful of pine nuts. He offered them to her. "You need to eat. Your body has been through much. Food will help you heal." Coraline took the offered food with trembling hands and began to eat. The venison was tough and required serious chewing, but it was the first real meat she had tasted in months. At the ranch, servants ate thin gruel and stale bread, never the good food reserved for the family and their guests. The pine nuts were sweet and rich with oil. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Daklugi tended to the fire and boiled water for tea made from herbs he pulled from his medicine pouch. As she ate, Corale's eyes roamed the cave, taking in detail she had missed in her earlier confusion. She saw Daklugi's rifle leaning against the wall, well-maintained and deadly. She saw his knife, the bone handle carved with intricate patterns. She saw his medicine pouch, his bedroll, the careful way he had organized his supplies.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Everything spoke of a man who lived by skill and preparation, who survived through knowledge and respect for the land. "Are you going to take me back?" she asked suddenly, fear creeping into her voice. "To the ranch?" Daklugi poured the hot tea into the tin cup, added a touch of honey from a small jar, and brought it to her. He waited until she had taken a sip before answering. "Tell me what happened," he said instead. "Tell me why they buried you." Coraline's hands tightened around the warm cup. For a moment, Daklugi thought she might refuse to speak. But then the words came tumbling out, rushed and desperate, as though she needed to expel the poison of the secret she had carried. "3 nights ago, I was bringing an oil lamp back to the hallway. It was late, past midnight. I was supposed to be asleep in the servants' quarters, but I had been scrubbing the kitchen and lost track of time. When I passed Mr. Thornton's study, I heard voices. Angry voices. I shouldn't have stopped. I know I shouldn't have. But I did." She paused to sip the tea, gathering courage to continue. Daklugi waited patiently, not pressing, letting her tell the story in her own time. "There were 4 men in the study: Mr. Thornton, who owns the ranch, Mr. Pike, who runs the mine, and 2 men I'd never seen before, but they looked mean, with guns on their belts. They were arguing about money. The mine payroll had gone missing, thousands of dollars. The foreman, Mr. Chun, had been asking questions about it. He had found discrepancies in the books. He was threatening to go to the territorial marshal." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, her eyes distant as she relived the memory. "Mr. Thornton said Mr. Chun was becoming a problem that needed solving. Mr. Pike said accidents happen in mines all the time. The 2 strangers laughed and said they'd take care of it for the right price. They were planning to kill him, to murder him and make it look like a cave-in." Daklugi's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had gone hard as flint. He had seen enough of white man's justice to know how little it meant when money was involved. "Mrs. Dalton saw you listening," he said. Not a question but a statement of fact. Coraline nodded miserably. "She grabbed me by the hair and dragged me away. She said if I ever spoke a word of what I'd heard, she'd make sure I regretted it. But I could tell by her eyes that she didn't believe threats would be enough. The next morning, she told Mr. Thornton I'd stolen bread from the kitchen. It was a lie. I never stole anything. But no one questioned her. No one ever questions her. And that night they came for you." Daklugi finished, "Yes, 3 of the ranch hands. They tied my hands and gagged me so I couldn't scream. They threw me in a wagon and drove me out into the desert. They had already dug the hole and brought the crate. They said I was lucky, that Mr. Thornton wanted to avoid a mess, that this way was cleaner than a bullet. They were drunk, They thought it was funny. Her voice broke, tears threatening again. She fought them back with visible effort, her small jaw set with determination. They threw me in the box and nailed the lid shut. I could hear them shoveling dirt on top. One of them said maybe in spring, when the snow melted, someone might find my bones. Another said more likely the coyotes would dig me up and scatter me across the desert. They were still laughing when I couldn't hear them anymore. Daklugi was quiet for a long moment, digesting this information. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "This foreman, Mr. Chun, is he still alive?" "I don't know," Coraline said. "I've been buried since yesterday. He might already be dead. They might have already made it look like an accident." Daklugi stood and walked to the cave entrance, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The sun was higher now, beginning to melt the fresh snow into a glittering carpet that would make tracking difficult, but not impossible. He stood there for several minutes, thinking through options and consequences. Finally, he turned back to face Coraline. "I cannot take you back to the ranch," he said bluntly. "If they learn you survived, they will try again. And next time, I will not be there to dig you out." "I know," Coraline whispered. "I knew that when I woke up. I have nowhere to go." "That is not entirely true," Daklugi said slowly, as though the idea was forming even as he spoke. "There is a settlement 2 days north of here. It is small, just a trading post and a dozen families. A missionary woman runs a school there for children who have nowhere else to go. Orphans, half-breeds, children abandoned by parents who could not feed them. She would take you in." Hope flickered in Coraline's eyes, followed quickly by doubt. "But what about Mr. Chun? If he's still alive, he's in terrible danger. Someone should warn him." Daklugi studied the child before him. This small girl who had every reason to think only of her own survival, but who worried instead about a man she barely knew. There was strength in her, he realized. Strength that had allowed her to survive being buried alive. Strength that would serve her well in the hard years ahead. "The mine is half a day's ride from here," he said. "If we leave now, we could reach it by nightfall. But it would be dangerous. If the men from the ranch see us, they will know you survived. They will come after both of us." "I don't care," Coraline said, her voice suddenly fierce. "Mr. Chun was always kind to me. When he came to the ranch for meetings, he would sneak me sweets from his pocket. Once, when I dropped a whole tray of dishes and Mrs. Dalton was going to beat me, he told her it was his fault for bumping the table. He took the blame. I can't just let him die." Daklugi saw in her eyes the same stubborn honor that had defined his own people, the code that said debts must be repaid and the helpless must be protected. It was not a white man's value. It was something older and deeper. He made his decision. "Then we go to the mine," he said. "But you will do exactly as I say when I say it. No questions, no hesitation. Your life and mine may depend on it. Do you understand?" "Yes," Coraline said immediately. "I promise." Daklugi began gathering his supplies with efficient movements, packing his bedroll and securing his weapons. He used snow to extinguish the fire, scattering the ashes and covering the evidence of their presence. When everything was ready, he turned to Coraline. "Can you walk?" She pushed aside the blankets and tried to stand. Her legs wobbled dangerously, and she would have fallen if Daklugi had not caught her arm. She looked up at him with frustration and determination mixed in equal measure. "I can try. Trying is not good enough," Daklugi said, but his tone was not unkind. "You will ride. I will walk alongside and lead the horse. It will be slower, but safer." He wrapped her in his heavy blanket, securing it around her shoulders with a leather cord. Then he lifted her easily and carried her outside to where his paint mare waited, pawing at the snow to reach the dried grass beneath. The horse nickered softly at their approach, her breath steaming in the cold morning air. Daklugi set Coraline in the saddle, then adjusted the stirrups as short as they would go. Even so, her feet barely reached them. He took the reins and began leading the horse away from the cave, heading south toward the mine. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the sun glinted off the white expanse around them. Bright enough to make Coraline squint, they traveled in silence for the first hour, Daklugi's eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of other riders. The landscape was deceptively peaceful, rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine, but he knew how quickly danger could appear in this country. Coraline swayed slightly in the saddle, exhausted despite having done nothing but sit. Her body was still recovering from its brush with death. Around midday, Daklugi called a halt in a sheltered draw where a frozen stream cut through the landscape. He helped Coraline down and made her eat more dried meat and drink water. She was shivering despite the blanket, her small body lacking the reserves to generate adequate heat. "Tell me about your mother," Daklugi said as they rested. It was a calculated question, designed to keep her mind active and focused on something other than cold and fear. Coraline's hand went to the locket around her neck, clutching it through the fabric of her dress. "She was beautiful," Coraline said softly. "She had blonde hair like mine, but hers was long and wavy. She used to brush it every night, 100 strokes, and sometimes she'd let me count. She smelled like lavender and bread dough. She worked as a seamstress before I was born. She could make anything with needle and thread. She made me a doll once, with a dress that had real buttons. What happened to her?" Daklugi asked gently. "Fever," Coraline said, the word heavy with old grief. "There was an outbreak in the town where we lived. Lots of people died. My father had already left us a year before that. He went to look for gold in California and never came back. After Mama died, I had no one. The town put me in an orphanage for a while, but they didn't have enough money to feed all the children. When I was 5, they sent me to work at the Thornton Ranch as a servant. They said I should be grateful for the opportunity." The bitterness in her young voice spoke of lessons learned too early about the cruelty of the world. Daklugi pulled something from his medicine pouch, a small carving of a bird in flight, whittled from white pine and smoothed until it was soft as silk. He had made it during long winter nights, his hands needing something to do while his mind wandered. He held it out to Coraline. "My grandmother taught me to carve," he said. "She said that when we make something beautiful, we put a piece of our spirit into it. That piece lives on, even after we are gone. Your mother put her spirit into you. You carry her beauty and her strength. That is a greater gift than any doll." Coraline took the carved bird with reverent hands, her eyes wide. "This is for me?" "Yes, keep it. When you are afraid, hold it and remember that you are stronger than you know. You survived what would have killed most grown men. That strength came from somewhere. It came from your mother's spirit living in you." Coraline closed her small fist around the carving and nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After a moment, she tucked it carefully into the pocket of her dress, next to her heart. They continued their journey as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Daklugi increased their pace, knowing they needed to reach the mine before full darkness fell. As they crested a final ridge, the mine came into view below them, a collection of rough wooden buildings clustered around the dark mouth of a shaft cut into the hillside. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and lamplight glowed in windows, but something was wrong. Even from this distance, Daklugi could sense it. No workers moved between the buildings. No sounds of industry carried on the wind. The mine was too quiet. He pulled the horse to a stop and studied the scene below with narrowed eyes. After a long moment, he turned to Coraline. "We may already be too late," he said quietly. "Stay close to me. And remember your promise. No matter what you see, you do as I say." Coraline nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they began the descent toward the silent mine, toward whatever truth waited in the gathering darkness. The descent toward the mine took longer than Daklugi had anticipated. The slope was treacherous with loose shale hidden beneath the snow, and he had to pick each step carefully to avoid sending rocks cascading down the hillside that would announce their arrival. The paint mare followed with the shoe-footedness of a mountain goat, her ears swiveling constantly as she sensed the tension in her rider and the man leading her. As they drew closer, the unnatural silence became more pronounced. A mining operation should be filled with noise, the clang of pickaxes against stone, the rumble of ore carts on wooden tracks, the shouts of men coordinating their labor. Instead, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Daklugi led them to a cluster of boulders about 50 yards from the nearest building. A long bunkhouse with peeling paint and a sagging roof. He helped Coraline down from the saddle and guided her to crouch behind the largest rock. His voice was barely audible. "Stay here. Do not move, do not make a sound. If I do not return within 1 hour, take the horse and ride north. Follow the North Star at night. In 2 days you will reach the settlement I told you about. Ask for Sister Margaret at the mission school. Tell her Daklugi sent you." "No," Coraline whispered urgently, her small hand gripping his sleeve. "Don't leave me alone. Please." Daklugi's expression softened for just a moment. He placed his hand over hers. "I must see what has happened here. If there is danger, I cannot protect you and investigate at the same time. You are safest here hidden. I will come back for you. I promise." Before she could protest further, he moved away with the silent grace of a predator, his body low to the ground as he used every bit of available cover. Coraline watched him disappear around the corner of the bunkhouse, her heart pounding so hard she was sure someone would hear it. She clutched the carved bird in her pocket, drawing what comfort she could from its smooth surface. Daklugi moved through the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun, his every sense alert. He reached the bunkhouse and pressed his back against the rough wood, listening. Nothing. He edged toward a window, its glass dirty and cracked, and peered inside. The interior was a mess of overturned bunks and scattered belongings, as though the men who lived here had left in a hurry or had been forced out. But there were no bodies, no blood, no obvious signs of violence. He continued to the next building, a cookhouse where meals would have been prepared for the workers. The door hung open on broken hinges. Inside, pots still sat on the cold stove, their contents long since congealed into unrecognizable masses. A table was set for a meal that had never been eaten, tin plates and cups arranged in neat rows. It was as though everyone had simply vanished in the middle of preparing dinner. The main office sat adjacent to the mine entrance itself, a sturdy structure built from hewn logs with a solid door and shuttered windows. Daklugi approached it with extreme caution, his hand on his knife. The door was closed, but not locked. He pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of hinges that needed oil. The office interior was dim, lit only by the fading daylight, filtering through cracks in the shutters. Daklugi's eyes adjusted quickly, taking in the details. A large desk dominated the room, its surface covered with papers and ledgers. A wooden filing cabinet stood against one wall, its drawers pulled open and contents rifled through. Someone had searched this office thoroughly, but it was the smell that made Daklugi's hand move to his rifle. Copper and rot, faint but unmistakable. The smell of death. He found the body behind the desk, sprawled on the floor in a position that spoke of sudden violence. The man was Chinese, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in the simple canvas pants and cotton shirt of a working foreman. His queue had been cut off, lying beside him like a dead snake. But it was the wound that told the real story. A single bullet hole in the center of his chest, the fabric around it stained dark with dried blood. Mr. Chun, Daklugi thought grimly. The man Coraline had tried to save. He knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb anything. The blood was completely dry, the flesh beginning to show signs of decay despite the cold. This man had been dead at least 2 days, probably 3. Which meant the murder had happened before Coraline was buried, perhaps even the same night she overheard the conversation. They had moved quickly to silence the threat. Daklugi began searching the office with systematic efficiency, looking for anything that might explain what had happened here. The ledgers on the desk showed columns of numbers, shipments of silver ore, wages paid to workers, supplies purchased. But as he studied them more carefully, he saw what Mr. Chin must have seen. The numbers did not add up. Ore was being shipped out, but the amounts recorded were significantly less than what was actually leaving the mine. The difference would represent thousands of dollars over the course of months. Someone was skimming from the mine's profits, recording false numbers and pocketing the difference. And when Mr. Chun had noticed the discrepancy, they had killed him to keep it quiet. A sound from outside froze Daklugi in place. Hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching at a steady trot. He moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. 5 riders were entering the mine compound, their horses blowing steam in the cold air. Even at this distance, Daklugi recognized the type, hired guns with cold eyes and easy violence. They wore long coats against the cold, but the bulges beneath suggested they were heavily armed. The lead rider was a tall man with a face like carved granite and a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He dismounted in front of the main office with the confidence of someone who owned the place. His voice carried clearly in the still air. "Check the bunkhouse again. If that foreman kept any records besides the official ledgers, they'll be hidden somewhere. Tear the place apart if you have to." 2 of the men peeled off toward the bunkhouse while the other 3 headed directly for the office. Daklugi had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the door. He grabbed the most damning of the ledgers from the desk, the one showing the clearest evidence of theft, and stuffed it inside his shirt. Then he moved to the back of the office where a small window offered the only other exit. The window was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, and it was latched from the inside. Daklugi worked the latch free as quietly as possible, but the old metal protested with a soft screech that sounded deafening in the quiet office. He pushed the window open and was halfway through when the office door burst inward. "Someone's been in here," the scarred man shouted. "The desk's been disturbed." Daklugi dropped the remaining distance to the ground outside and ran, keeping the office building between himself and the men. Shouts erupted behind him as they discovered the open window. A gunshot cracked, the bullet splintering wood somewhere to his right. He zigzagged, making himself a harder target. As he sprinted toward the boulders where he had left Coraline, she was exactly where he had told her to stay, her eyes wide with terror as she heard the gunshots. When she saw him running toward her, she started to rise, but he made a sharp gesture that sent her back down behind the rock. He reached the mare and grabbed the reins, then scooped Coraline up with one arm and practically threw her into the saddle. "Hold on tight and don't let go no matter what happens," he commanded, his voice urgent but controlled. He swung up behind her and kicked the mare into an immediate gallop, heading not up the slope they had descended, but along the base of the hill where the terrain was more level. More gunshots rang out, but they were already moving fast and the light was fading. Daklugi leaned low over Coraline's head, making himself and her as small a target as possible. The mare ran with everything she had, her powerful legs eating up the ground as the mine fell away behind them. The pursuit was immediate. Daklugi could hear the thunder of hooves behind them, the shouts of men organizing themselves for a chase. He guided the mare into a narrow canyon where the walls rose steep on either side, gambling that the confined space would prevent the pursuers from spreading out and cutting them off. The canyon floor was rocky and treacherous, but his mare was sure-footed and knew her rider trusted her judgment. Coraline pressed herself against the mare's neck, her small body rigid with fear. Daklugi kept one arm wrapped firmly around her waist while his other hand managed the reins with expert precision. The canyon twisted and turned, and he used every bend to break line of sight with their pursuers. hoping the gathering darkness would work in their favor. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes of hard riding, Daklugi pulled the mare to a halt in a section where the canyon widened slightly and a tumble of massive boulders created a maze of passages. He dismounted and pulled Coraline down, then led the mare into a narrow gap between two house-sized rocks where they would be invisible from the main canyon floor. The sound of pursuing horses grew louder, then stopped. Voices echoed off the canyon walls, distorted and hard to pinpoint. The scarred man's voice rang out clearly. "They came in here. Spread out but stay within sight of each other. They can't have gone far on a single horse carrying double." Daklugi pressed Coraline against the cold stone and put a finger to his lips. She nodded understanding, her face pale in the dimness. He drew his knife, preferring its silence to the rifle that would give away their position with its muzzle flash and report. The mare stood perfectly still, trained through years of hunting to remain quiet when her rider needed stealth. Footsteps crunched on gravel, coming closer. One of the hired guns was working his way through the boulder field, checking each gap and hollow. Daklugi could hear him muttering under his breath, cursing the cold and the darkness and the difficulty of tracking in these conditions. The footsteps came closer still. The man appeared at the entrance to their hiding place, silhouetted against the slightly lighter darkness of the open canyon. For a frozen moment, he stood there, peering into the shadows, his rifle held ready. Daklugi could see the indecision on his face, wondering if the darkness hid anything or if this was just another empty space. Then the man's eyes adjusted and he saw them. His mouth opened to shout a warning. Daklugi moved like lightning. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his left hand clamping over the man's mouth while his right drove the knife up under the ribs, angling toward the heart. The man's rifle clattered to the stones as he convulsed, his scream dying in his throat as a wet gurgle. Daklugi held him until the struggles weakened and stopped, then lowered the body silently to the ground. "Don't look," he whispered urgently to Coraline. But he knew from the horror in her eyes that she had already seen. More shouts echoed through the canyon, the other searchers calling to their companion, who had not responded. Daklugi cleaned his knife quickly and sheathed it, then picked up the dead man's rifle and ammunition. They could not stay here. The body would be found soon, and then the searchers would converge on this location. He led them deeper into the boulder maze, moving as quickly as silence allowed, the mare following close behind. The passages between the rocks were narrow and confusing, twisting back on themselves and sometimes ending in dead ends that forced them to backtrack. But Daklugi had hunted in similar terrain and understood how to read the subtle signs of which passages led through and which were traps. They emerged on the far side of the boulder field just as full darkness fell over the canyon. Behind them, they heard the shout as someone discovered the body. More voices joined in anger and alarm. But Daklugi was already leading them up a steep game trail that climbed the canyon wall, a path invisible in the darkness to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. The climb was brutal. The trail was barely wide enough for the mare, and in places Daklugi had to dismount and lead her carefully around sections, where a single misstep would send them plunging to the rocks below. Coraline clung to the saddle horn with white-knuckled hands, her eyes squeezed shut, trusting the horse and the man to keep her safe. They reached the top of the canyon wall just as the moon rose, casting silver light across the high desert landscape. Behind and below them, they could see the flickering of torches as the hired guns searched the canyon, their efforts now focused on the boulder field where their companion had died. But the pursuers were looking down, not up, never imagining that their quarry would attempt such a dangerous climb in darkness. Daklugi allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, then helped Coraline dismount. She was shaking, whether from cold or shock or both he could not tell. He wrapped his arms around her, sharing his warmth, while the mare stood nearby with her head down, flanks heaving from the exertion. "You did well," he told Coraline quietly. "You were brave and you were quiet. Those are the things that kept us alive. You killed that man," she whispered against his chest. "I saw you, yes," Daklugi said, not trying to soften the truth. "I killed him because if I had not, he would have killed us both. That is the way of things sometimes. I am sorry you had to see it." Coraline was quiet for a long moment, processing this harsh reality.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
When she spoke again, her voice was small but steady. "Mr. Chun is dead, isn't he? That's why the mine was so quiet." "They killed him, yes," Daklugi confirmed. "I found his body in the office. He has been dead for several days. The men who killed him are the same ones who just chased us. They are searching for something, probably evidence that would prove what they did." He pulled the stolen ledger from inside his shirt and showed it to her in the moonlight. "This is what they are looking for. These numbers prove that someone has been stealing from the mine. Mr. Chun discovered it, and they killed him to keep him quiet. Just as they tried to kill you." Coraline looked at the ledger with understanding beyond her years. "So we have proof. We can take it to the law, perhaps," Daklugi said carefully. "But first we must survive long enough to reach someone who will listen. Those men will not stop hunting us as long as we have this ledger. They cannot afford to let us live." He stood and helped Coraline back into the saddle, then swung up behind her. The mare was tired but still strong, and they had a long night ahead of them. Daklugi pointed the horse north, toward distant mountains that showed as a darker line against the star-filled sky. "There is a place I know," he said as they began to move. "An old Apache camp in the high country, hidden in a box canyon that few white men have ever seen. We can rest there safely while we decide what to do next." As they rode through the night, leaving the mine and its dangers behind, Coraline felt the carved bird in her pocket and drew strength from it. She had survived being buried alive. She had survived a desperate chase and a killing. She was still alive, still breathing, still fighting. Her mother's spirit within her was strong. Behind them, the torches at the mine continued to search. But ahead, in the darkness and the unknown, lay the possibility of safety and perhaps even justice. They rode toward it together, the Apache warrior and the servant child, bound now by shared danger and a secret that powerful men would kill to protect. The moon climbed higher, lighting their way across the vast and empty land. The night was bitterly cold, and frost formed on the mare's mane as they climbed higher into the mountains. Daklugi kept the pace steady but not punishing, knowing that pushing the horse too hard in these conditions could cripple her, leaving them stranded and vulnerable. Coraline had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep against his chest, her small body going limp as adrenaline finally gave way to the bone-deep weariness that follows terror. They rode through landscapes painted silver by moonlight, past towering ponderosa pines whose branches creaked under loads of snow, across frozen meadows where their passage left dark tracks in the pristine white. Daklugi's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, watching for the telltale glow of torches or the movement of riders against the horizon. But the night remained empty except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf claiming territory. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale gold, they reached the entrance to the box canyon Daklugi had spoken of. It was hidden behind a narrow cleft in the rock face, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through, and easily missed by anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Ancient petroglyphs marked the stone walls, symbols left by Daklugi's ancestors centuries ago, spirals and handprints and the distinctive shapes of bighorn sheep. The passage twisted through solid rock for perhaps 50 yards before opening into a sheltered canyon perhaps 200 yards across. Sheer cliffs rose on 3 sides, their faces smooth and unclimbable, while the 4th side was blocked by the narrow entrance they had just passed through. A small spring fed a pool of clear water at the canyon's center, steam rising from its surface in the cold morning air, revealing its source as a hot spring heated by volcanic activity deep underground. Along one wall, protected by an overhang of rock, were the remains of ancient dwellings, stone structures built into natural caves, their walls still mostly intact after hundreds of years. Daklugi had discovered this place years ago while tracking a wounded bear, and he had returned many times when he needed solitude or safety. Few living people knew of its existence. He guided the mare to the largest of the stone dwellings and dismounted, his legs stiff from the long night of riding. He lifted Coraline down carefully, and she stirred, blinking in the growing light. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the cold night air. "Somewhere safe," Daklugi answered. "A place my people used long ago, before the white men came and pushed us from our lands. We can rest here without fear of discovery." He led the mare to the spring and allowed her to drink her fill of the warm water, then removed her saddle and rubbed her down with handfuls of dried grass he found growing in a sheltered corner. The horse had served them well, and he would not neglect her care. Once she was settled with a blanket over her back and grain from his saddlebags to eat, he turned his attention to making Coraline comfortable. Inside the stone dwelling, protected from the wind, he built a fire using wood he had stored here on a previous visit. The smoke rose through a natural chimney in the rock above, dispersing before it could be seen from any distance. As the flames grew and warmth began to fill the small space, Coraline moved closer, holding her hands toward the heat. Daklugi prepared a more substantial meal than they had eaten in days, cooking strips of venison in a small pan over the fire and mixing cornmeal with water to make simple cakes that he baked on a flat stone. The smell of cooking food made Coraline's stomach growl audibly, reminding her that she had eaten almost nothing since being buried. When Daklugi handed her a tin plate piled with food, she ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had come close to starvation. "Slowly," he cautioned again. "Your stomach has been empty too long. If you eat too fast, you will only make yourself sick." She forced herself to slow down, chewing each bite thoroughly, though every instinct screamed at her to devour the food as quickly as possible. Daklugi ate more sparingly, years of living in harsh conditions having taught him to make provisions last. As they ate, the sun climbed higher, its light filling the canyon with warmth that seemed miraculous after the brutal cold of the night. When they had finished eating, Daklugi pulled the stolen ledger from his shirt, where he had kept it protected against his body. He opened it carefully, studying the columns of numbers in the growing daylight. Coraline moved to sit beside him, looking at the pages with curiosity. "Can you read numbers?" he asked her. "Yes, sir," she said. "Mrs. Dalton made all the servants learn basic arithmetic so we could keep household accounts. I was good at it. Better than the older children, even." Daklugi pointed to a column labeled ore shipped. "These numbers show how much silver ore left the mine each month. But if you look here," he moved his finger to another column labeled ore processed. "These numbers show how much ore the mine claims to have dug from the ground. The two numbers should be the same, yes?" Coraline studied the figures, her young brow furrowing in concentration. "But they're not the same. The shipped amount is much higher. Almost twice as high in some months." "Exactly," Daklugi confirmed. "Which means the mine is producing far more silver than they claim. Someone is recording false numbers and keeping the difference. Over many months, this would add up to a fortune, Mr. Thornton," Coraline said with certainty. "He owns the mine. And Mr. Pike, the mine boss. They're the only ones who could change the official records, but they would need help," Daklugi added. "Someone to transport the extra ore without it being noticed. Someone to sell it to refineries under false names. This kind of theft requires many people working together." Coraline's expression darkened as understanding grew. "That's why they had to kill Mr. Chun. He was honest. If he had reported what he found, everyone involved would have been arrested. They would have lost everything. And that is why they tried to kill you, Deklugi said gently. You heard them planning the murder. You could have testified against them. As long as you live, they are in danger. The weight of this knowledge settled over Coraline like a physical burden. She was 7 years old, and powerful men wanted her dead. The injustice of it made her eyes sting with angry tears. It's not fair, she whispered. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, Deklugi said firmly. You were in the right place. You heard the truth when others would have remained ignorant. That is not a curse. It is a responsibility. He closed the ledger and set it aside, then looked at Coraline with an intensity that made her meet his eyes. My people have a saying. The truth is like a seed planted in the earth. It may be buried deep, covered over with lies and forgotten, but eventually it will grow and break through to the light. You are the guardian of that seed now. What you know, what is written in this book, this is the truth trying to grow. We must make sure it reaches the light, but how? Coraline asked. Who would believe us? I'm just a servant child, and you're... She stopped, suddenly embarrassed. Apache. Deklugi finished for her without offense. Yes, in the white man's courts, my word means little. Often less than nothing. They see my skin and my hair and decide I am a liar before I even speak. This I know very well. He stood and walked to the entrance of the dwelling, looking out at the peaceful canyon. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. When I was younger, not much older than you are now, I watched white soldiers burn my village. They said we had stolen cattle from a ranch. It was a lie. We had stolen nothing. But one white man claimed we had, and his word was believed over the word of an entire village. They burned everything. My mother died in that fire. My sister, the one I told you about, she survived the burning but was hanged 2 years later when she tried to tell the territorial judge what had really happened. They said she was lying to protect her people. They said Indians were born liars and could not be trusted. Coraline came to stand beside him, her small hand slipping into his larger one. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing. Just held his hand and let him know through that simple touch that she understood his pain. After a moment, Deklugi continued, but there are some white people who are different. Not many, but some. People who care more about truth than about the color of a person's skin. We must find such a person and give them this evidence. Someone with enough power and integrity to act on what we show them. Sister Margaret, Coraline said suddenly. At the mission school you told me about. Would she help? Deklugi considered this carefully. Perhaps. Sister Margaret is respected in the territory. She has fought the territorial government before, demanding better treatment for the children in her care. She does not fear powerful men. But the mission is still 2 days' travel from here. And those men will be searching every road and trail between here and there. Then we don't use the roads, Coraline said with the simple logic of a child. We go through the mountains where they won't expect us. A slight smile touched Deklugi's lips. You think like a warrior. Yes, through the mountains is safer. Slower, harder, but safer. We will rest here today while the horse recovers her strength. Tonight, when darkness hides our movement, we will continue north through the high country. They spent the day in the hidden canyon, and for a few hours, it almost felt like peace. Deklugi taught Coraline how to identify edible plants growing in the sheltered microclimates along the canyon walls, how to read the signs that animals left behind, how to move silently through terrain without leaving obvious tracks. She absorbed the lessons with an eagerness that surprised him, her quick mind grasping concepts that many adults struggled to understand. In the afternoon, while Coraline napped by the fire, exhaustion finally claiming her, Deklugi climbed to a high point on the canyon rim where he could observe the surrounding landscape without being seen. For a long time, he saw nothing unusual, just the normal patterns of wildlife moving through their territories. But as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, he spotted movement in the distance, riders, perhaps a dozen of them, spread out in a search pattern. They were still several miles away, but they were moving in the general direction of the canyon. Someone among them was a skilled tracker, reading signs that Deklugi had thought he had concealed. They had not found the canyon yet, but it was only a matter of time. He climbed down quickly and returned to the dwelling. Coraline was awake, feeding small sticks to the fire. She looked up as he entered and immediately saw the tension in his face. "They're coming, aren't they?" "Yes, not here yet, but closer than I hoped. We cannot wait for darkness. We must leave now while we still have several hours head start." Coraline did not argue or complain. She simply stood and began helping him pack their supplies with an efficiency that spoke of her years as a servant, trained to work quickly and follow instructions without question. Within minutes they had erased all signs of their presence, scattering the fire and smoothing the earth where they had walked. Deklugi saddled the mare and lifted Coraline up, then swung up behind her. Instead of exiting through the narrow passage where they had entered, he guided the horse to the back of the canyon where a game trail, barely visible to the untrained eye, zigzagged up the sheer cliff face. It was a route he had scouted long ago but never used, knowing it existed as an emergency escape if he ever needed one. The climb was harrowing. The trail was barely wide enough for the mare's hooves, and in several places, rocks had fallen away, leaving gaps that had to be jumped. One misstep would send them plunging hundreds of feet to the canyon floor. Coraline kept her eyes closed through most of it, her arms wrapped tightly around the mare's neck, while Deklugi guided the horse with whispered commands and subtle shifts of his weight. They reached the top just as the last light of day was fading from the sky. Behind them, far below, Deklugi could see torches entering the canyon through the main entrance. The searchers had found their hiding place, but by the time they discovered the escape route and managed to follow it, Deklugi and Coraline would be miles away. They rode north through the gathering darkness, climbing higher into mountains where snow lay deep in pine trees, grew so thick that traveling between them required constant vigilance. The temperature plummeted as they gained altitude, and frost formed on their eyebrows and the mare's whiskers. Coraline's teeth chattered despite the blankets wrapped around her. Deklugi knew they could not continue much longer without rest. The horse was exhausted, and Coraline's small body could not withstand much more cold. As the moon rose, casting silver light through the forest, he spotted what he had been hoping to find, a small hunting cabin built by trappers decades ago and long abandoned. The cabin was barely standing, its roof sagging and one wall partially collapsed, but it offered shelter from the wind. Deklugi guided the mare into the lee of the structure where she would be protected, then carried Coraline inside. There was no time to build a proper fire. The smoke would be visible for miles in the clear night air. But he arranged their blankets in the driest corner and wrapped Coraline in layers until only her face was visible. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know you are cold, but we cannot risk a fire tonight. Tomorrow, when we are farther away, we can have warmth again." "It's okay," Coraline said, though her voice shook with cold. "I'm alive. That's what matters. Mr. Chun wasn't so lucky." Deklugi settled beside her, using his body heat to add to her warmth. In the darkness, they could hear the distant sound of dogs barking, bloodhounds brought in to follow their scent. The pursuit was relentless. "Why are they trying so hard?" Coraline asked. "They already killed Mr. Chun. Why do they need to kill us too?" "Because we have proof," Deklugi answered. "Without the ledger, there is no evidence of their crime. Mr. Chun's death could be explained as an accident. But if we reach someone in authority with this book, everything changes. They will be arrested, tried, probably hanged. They are fighting for their lives now, just as we are." Coraline was quiet for a moment, then asked in a small voice, "Do you think we'll make it? To the mission?" Daklugi did not answer immediately. He believed in speaking truth, especially to those who were brave enough to face it. "I do not know," he said finally. "The odds are not good. They have more men, more resources, and they know this territory as well as I do. But we have something they do not have. What's that? We have a reason to survive that is stronger than theirs. They fight to protect their wealth and their reputations. We fight for justice, for truth, for the memory of a good man who was murdered. That kind of purpose gives strength that money cannot buy." Coraline considered this, then nodded against his chest. "My mother used to say that God protects children and fools. Maybe he'll protect us, perhaps," Daklugi said. "Though in my experience, God helps most those who help themselves. Tomorrow we will need to be smart and fast and very lucky. But tonight, we rest and gather our strength." Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the voices of angry spirits. The sounds of pursuit faded as the searchers made camp for the night, their fires visible as distant orange pinpoints in the vast darkness. Daklugi sat watch through the long cold hours, his rifle across his lap. His eyes never leaving the forest around them. Coraline slept fitfully, whimpering occasionally in dreams that replayed the horrors of the past days. Each time she cried out, Daklugi placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, anchoring her to the present, reminding her through touch that she was not alone. Gradually her breathing would steady again, and she would sink back into deeper sleep. As false dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Daklugi roused her gently. They had to move before the sun rose, and the trackers could follow their trail. He gave her the last of their food, insisting she eat even though he took nothing for himself. She was growing. Her body needed fuel more than his did. They emerged from the cabin into a world transformed by frost. Every branch, every blade of grass was coated in crystalline ice that glittered like diamonds in the pre-dawn light. Their breath hung in clouds that seemed to glow with their own inner light. It was breathtakingly beautiful and deadly cold. Daklugi helped Coraline into the saddle one more time, then led the mare deeper into the high country, toward the distant mountains where the mission waited. Behind them, as the sun rose, the pursuit began again. Dogs bayed as they picked up the scent. Men shouted to each other as they organized their search. But ahead, somewhere in the vast wilderness, lay the possibility of sanctuary. They rode toward it with determination, the warrior and the child, carrying between them the truth that powerful men would kill to suppress. The final race had begun. The mission came into view just as the sun reached its zenith. A collection of whitewashed adobe buildings clustered around a small chapel with a wooden cross rising from its peaked roof. Smoke curled from several chimneys, and the sound of children's voices drifted across the distance. A sound so ordinary and peaceful it seemed to belong to another world entirely. Daklugi and Coraline had pushed through the final miles in a state of desperate exhaustion. The mare stumbled frequently now, her strength finally giving out after days of continuous travel. Coraline swayed in the saddle, barely conscious, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration despite Daklugi's careful rationing of their water. He himself moved through sheer force of will, his body demanding rest that he could not afford to give. They had stayed ahead of their pursuers by abandoning all caution and making a straight dash through terrain so treacherous that sane men would never attempt it. Each obstacle had bought them precious time, but also drained their remaining reserves. Now seeing the mission walls ahead, Daklugi felt something he had not allowed himself to feel before. Hope, but that hope died as he crested the final ridge and saw what waited in the valley below. Between them and the mission, perhaps half a mile distant, were the riders. They had somehow circled ahead during the night, anticipating this destination and laying a trap. 8 men on horseback blocked the only approach to the mission, spread out in a line with rifles resting across their saddles. The scarred leader sat in the center, his face grim with satisfaction. Daklugi reined the mare to a halt and assessed the situation with the tactical mind of a warrior. There was no way to ride past them. No way to fight through 8 armed men. Then his eyes fell on a narrow footbridge spanning a gorge to their right, connecting their ridge to another outcropping that led to the mission by a different route. The bridge was ancient, built by Spanish missionaries a century ago. Its wooden planks gray with age, and many of them rotted through. It swayed in the wind like a living thing, suspended over a drop of at least 200 feet to jagged rocks and a frozen stream below. No one had used it in years. No one would dare. "Hold tight," Daklugi said, turning the mare toward the bridge. Coraline's arms tightened around his waist as she realized his intention. "We can't," she whispered. "It'll never hold us. It is our only chance," he replied, and urged the trembling mare forward. Below them, the scarred man saw their movement and shouted orders. The line of riders surged forward, racing to cut them off before they reached the bridge. Daklugi kicked the mare into a gallop she did not have the strength to sustain, but the brave animal gave everything she had left. They reached the bridge seconds before the first rider, and Daklugi did not hesitate. The mare's front hooves hit the first plank, and the entire structure groaned. The wood was slick with ice, and the horse's iron shoes skidded dangerously. Daklugi leaned forward, using his weight to help balance, while Coraline pressed herself flat against the mare's neck. Behind them, a gunshot cracked, the bullet splintering wood somewhere to their left. The bridge swayed wildly with each step, planks cracking under the combined weight of horse and riders. Daklugi did not look down at the dizzying drop, keeping his eyes fixed on the far side, still 30 yards away. The mare whinnied in terror but continued forward, trusting the rider who had never led her wrong before. They were halfway across when a plank gave way completely beneath the mare's right hind leg. The horse lurched sideways, and for a heart-stopping moment, Daklugi thought they would go over the edge. But the mare recovered, pulling her leg free, and continuing forward on 3 legs, the fourth dangling uselessly, clearly broken. More gunshots rang out. The riders had reached the bridge entrance and were firing from solid ground, but the swaying motion made accurate shooting impossible. Still, bullets whined past close enough that Daklugi felt their passage. Then, from the mission below, a bell began to ring. Not the gentle call to prayer, but an urgent clanging alarm. Doors burst open, and people emerged, nuns in black habits, children of all ages, and one tall figure in gray robes who could only be Sister Margaret. 10 yards from the far side, another plank collapsed. This time the mare could not recover. Her broken leg could not support her weight, and she began to fall. Daklugi had a split second to make a decision. He grabbed Coraline and threw himself sideways off the falling horse, aiming for the edge of the bridge. His hands caught the rope railing as they fell, the impact nearly tearing his arms from their sockets. Coraline screamed as they swung beneath the bridge, suspended over the void by Daklugi's grip alone. Below them, the mare fell silently, tumbling end over end until she struck the rocks at the bottom with a sickening impact. Daklugi's fingers were slipping on the icy rope. He looked up and saw Coraline's terrified face inches from his own. "Climb," he commanded through gritted teeth. "Climb up my body and get to the planks. You are small enough." "They will hold you. I can't leave you," she sobbed. "You must," he said, his voice strained with the effort of holding them both. "Climb now." "That is an order." With shaking limbs, Coraline began to climb, using Daklugi's body like a ladder. Her weight shifted, making his grip even more precarious, but he held on with the last of his strength. She reached the planks and pulled herself up, then reached down for his hand. Daklugi looked past her and saw Sister Margaret running across the stable section of the bridge toward them, her robes hiked up around her knees. "Hold on, child," the nun shouted. "I'm coming." But Daklugi's fingers could hold no longer. He felt his grip failing. In that final moment, He pulled the ledger from inside his shirt with his free hand and threw it upward. It landed on the bridge beside Coraline. "Give it to Sister Margaret," he said. "Tell her everything." His words ended as his grip failed completely. He fell backward into space. A hand caught his wrist. Impossible, but real. He jerked to a stop, his shoulders screaming in protest. He looked up in disbelief and saw Sister Margaret lying on her stomach on the bridge, both of her hands wrapped around his wrist in a grip like iron. "I will not lose another soul to this wilderness," she said through clenched teeth. "You will climb, and you will live." Somehow, drawing on reserves he did not know he possessed, Daklugi began to climb. His other hand found the rope, then a plank. Sister Margaret pulled with surprising strength, and Coraline grabbed his shirt, adding her small weight to the effort. Inch by impossible inch, he climbed back onto the bridge. They collapsed together on the swaying planks, all three of them gasping for breath. From the far side of the gorge, the scarred man screamed in frustration and fired his rifle repeatedly. But they were out of range now. "Can you walk?" Sister Margaret asked Daklugi. "Yes," he said, though he was not entirely certain it was true. "Then let us get off this death trap before it decides to finish what those men started." They made their way to solid ground, moving carefully over the damaged sections. Sister Margaret led them quickly down the path to the mission compound. As they approached, Daklugi saw that children he had noticed earlier were taking positions along the walls, and several of the older boys held rifles, "I have learned," Sister Margaret said, "that faith without preparation is foolishness. We have been raided before. We will not be intimidated by these men." She led them to the chapel and sat them down while she examined Daklugi's injuries. His hands were badly torn, and his shoulder hung at an odd angle. Without warning, she grabbed his arm and pulled sharply. There was a pop as the joint relocated. "Forgive my abruptness," she said, "but we have little time. Now tell me quickly why those men want you dead." Coraline picked up the ledger with shaking hands and offered it to Sister Margaret. In a voice that grew stronger as she spoke, Coraline told the entire story. The overheard conversation, the murder plan, being buried alive, Daklugi's rescue, the discovery of Mr. Chun's body, the theft documented in the ledger. Sister Margaret listened in silence, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When Coraline finished, the nun opened the ledger and studied the numbers. After several minutes, she closed it. "This is bigger than I thought," she said quietly. "Some of these men have influence in the territorial government. The corruption goes very deep indeed. Will you help us?" Coraline asked. Sister Margaret's face softened. She reached out and cupped Coraline's face in her hands. "Child, I have spent 30 years fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. I will not stop now." She stood and went to a cabinet, withdrawing a locked box which she opened. With a key worn on a chain around her neck, "The territorial governor owes me a favor. A large one. I helped his son recover from addiction and kept the matter private. I am going to send my fastest rider to the capital with this ledger and a letter. The governor will have no choice but to act. But what about now?" Daklugi asked. "Those men will be here in minutes. Then they will be disappointed," Sister Margaret said firmly. "This mission is on federal land. Any attack on it is an attack on the government itself." The sound of approaching horses reached them. Sister Margaret walked out to meet the riders, Daklugi and Coraline following close behind. The nun positioned herself directly in front of the gates. "That is far enough," she called out when the riders were 20 yards away. "Stake your business." The scarred man reined his horse to a stop. "We are looking for a fugitive, sister. An Indian who kidnapped a child. We demand you turn them over." "Demand?" Sister Margaret's voice could have frozen the sun. "You demand nothing on this land. These people have claimed sanctuary. If you have legal complaints, take them to the territorial marshal. We are not leaving without that child. I protect the innocent from the guilty." Sister Margaret replied. "And having heard their story, I know exactly which category each of you falls into. You murdered an honest man and buried this child alive to silence her. Do not speak to me of law and justice." The scarred man's face went white, then red with rage. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then from the north came the sound of many horses approaching at a gallop. A column of riders appeared, perhaps 20 men in the blue uniforms of the United States Cavalry. Sister Margaret smiled grimly. "I sent for them yesterday. The captain is a good friend. I thought we might have need of federal authority." The scarred man looked at the approaching cavalry, then back at Sister Margaret. Finally he jerked his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Oh, but it is," Sister Margaret replied. "Captain Reynolds, I believe these men are wanted for murder. Perhaps you would be so kind as to detain them." The cavalry surrounded the 8 riders before they could flee. Within minutes, all 8 were being led away toward the territorial capital where they would face justice. Coraline watched them go, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to cry tears of relief. Daklugi knelt beside her and pulled her into an embrace. "It is over," he said softly. "You are safe now. The truth has won." Sister Margaret watched them both with knowing eyes. "Come," she said gently. "Both of you need food, rest, and proper medical care. Tomorrow we will worry about what comes next. But today you have survived, and that is enough." As they walked together into the mission, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, flooding the compound with golden light. 3 weeks had passed since the day Daklugi and Coraline arrived at the mission, and the Arizona high country had begun its slow transformation from winter's grip to the tentative promise of spring. Snow still capped the distant mountains, but in the valley where the mission stood, wildflowers were beginning to push through the thawing earth, dots of purple and yellow against the brown landscape. Coraline sat at a wooden desk in the mission schoolroom, a slate board before her and a piece of chalk in her bandaged hand. Her fingers had healed remarkably well under Sister Margaret's care, though pale scars would always mark where the wood of the crate had torn her skin. She was practicing her letters, copying sentences from a primer, her tongue poking out slightly, in concentration as she formed each character with painstaking care. Around her, 24 other children worked at similar tasks, a mixture of ages and backgrounds that would have been impossible in most schools of the territory. There were Apache children, Navajo, Mexican, and white, orphans and half-breeds, children abandoned or rescued from situations even worse than Coraline's had been. Sister Margaret made no distinctions among them. In her schoolroom, every child was equal, every soul worth saving. Through the window, Coraline could see Daklugi working in the mission's garden plot, turning soil in preparation for spring planting. His shoulder had healed slowly, and Sister Margaret had forbidden him from any strenuous activity for the first 2 weeks. But now he moved with something approaching his old fluid grace. Though Coraline noticed he still favored his left arm slightly, a shadow fell across Coraline's slate. She looked up to find Sister Margaret standing beside her desk, studying her work with the critical eye of an experienced teacher. "Your letters are improving," the nun said. "But you are pressing too hard with the chalk. Gentle strokes, child. Come with me. There is news." They walked together across the compound to the small office where Sister Margaret conducted the mission's business. Inside, the office was organized chaos, shelves lined with ledgers and correspondence, a large desk covered with papers awaiting the nun's attention. From a drawer, she withdrew an official-looking document bearing multiple seals and signatures. "This arrived this morning by courier from the territorial capital," Sister Margaret said. "I thought you should hear the news directly." The territorial governor acted swiftly once he reviewed the ledger. "All 8 men who pursued you have been arrested and charged with murder, conspiracy, and theft." But the investigation expanded. In total, 17 men have been arrested, including Mr. Thornton, the mine supervisor, and 2 territorial officials who were taking bribes. Coraline's eyes went wide. Mr. Thornton was arrested? And Mrs. Dalton? Mrs. Dalton was also taken into custody, Sister Margaret confirmed. She has confessed to her role in your attempted murder in exchange for a lighter sentence. Her testimony has been crucial. The trial is scheduled for next month, and the prosecutor has asked if you would be willing to testify about what you overheard that night. Fear flickered across Coraline's face. The thought of standing in a courtroom, of facing those men again, made her stomach clench. I know it frightens you, Sister Margaret said gently. But your testimony could ensure these men face appropriate punishment. Mr. Chun deserves justice. And you deserve to see his killers held accountable. Coraline thought about Mr. Chun. About his kindness to a servant child who meant nothing to anyone else. About the sweets he had snuck her. About how he had taken the blame for her accident to save her from a beating. I'll do it, she said, her voice small but determined. I'll testify. Mr. Chun would have stood up for me. I can stand up for him. Sister Margaret's stern face softened into something approaching a smile. You are braver than you know, child. But you will not face it alone. I will accompany you to the capital, and Deklugi has already informed me that he intends to go as well. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a knock sounded at the office door. Sister Margaret called permission to enter, and Deklugi stepped inside, still dusty from his work in the garden. The courier who brought your letter is still here, he said without preamble. He says there is another matter that requires discussion. They crossed the compound to the guest house where the courier waited. The young man pulled another envelope from his saddlebag. This came for the Apache. Deklugi, he said, pronouncing the name carefully. From the Office of Indian Affairs in the territorial capital. I was instructed to deliver it personally. Deklugi took the envelope with obvious suspicion. In his experience, nothing good ever came from the Office of Indian Affairs. He opened it carefully and read slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the formal English. What does it say? Coraline asked when he had finished. Deklugi looked at Sister Margaret, his expression unreadable. They are offering me a position, he said slowly, as a scout and translator for the territorial government. They say my actions in protecting the child and bringing evidence of corruption have demonstrated loyalty and capability. They are willing to pay a salary and provide housing. Sister Margaret's eyebrows rose. That is quite an offer. The territorial government does not usually extend such opportunities to Apache men. It comes with conditions, Deklugi said. I would be required to work with the cavalry to help them track criminals and renegades. Some of those renegades might be my own people. The weight of that reality hung heavy in the air. Coraline looked between the two adults, sensing the complexity of the decision Deklugi faced. You saved my life, she said quietly. You could have left me buried in that frozen ground. You could have turned away when they came after us. But you didn't. You did the right thing even when it was hard. Whatever you decide now, I know you'll do the right thing again. Deklugi looked down at her, and something in his hard features softened. He placed a hand on her shoulder. You have become wise beyond your years, little one. This ordeal has aged you. I wish it had not been necessary. He turned back to Sister Margaret. I will consider the offer. But I have another question first. What will happen to Coraline? When the trial is over and the men are punished, where will she go? Sister Margaret had clearly been expecting this question. She will stay here at the mission for as long as she wishes. She has a place in our school, in our community. Many of our children stay until they are old enough to make their own way in the world. But she will have no family, Deklugi said. No one who is bound to her by more than charity and duty. Sister Margaret studied him with knowing eyes. Are you suggesting an alternative arrangement? Deklugi was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as though he was discovering his own thoughts as he voiced them. Among my people, when a warrior saves a life, that life becomes his responsibility. It is not ownership, but a sacred bond. I pulled Coraline from the earth. In doing so, I took on the obligation to ensure her life continues to have meaning and purpose. If she were Apache, she would be considered part of my family now, regardless of blood. Coraline's breath caught. She looked up at Deklugi with wide eyes. Are you saying you want to be my family? I am saying you already are my family, Deklugi replied. The question is whether the white man's law will recognize what my people's law already considers truth. Sister Margaret tapped her fingers thoughtfully. It would be complicated. The territorial courts have never, to my knowledge, approved an adoption of a white child by an Apache man. There would be opposition, perhaps significant opposition. But I have some influence with the territorial governor. If this is truly what both of you want, I will advocate for it with every resource at my disposal. Coraline did not hesitate. She threw her arms around Deklugi's waist and held on as though he might disappear if she let go. Please, she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. Please don't leave me. You're the only person who's ever really protected me. The only one who saw me as someone worth saving. Deklugi returned the embrace awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. His large hands rested gently on her back. Then it is decided, he said. I will accept the territorial government's offer on one condition. That they approve my petition to become Coraline's legal guardian. If they refuse, I will refuse their offer, and we will find another way. That evening, as the sun set behind the western mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Deklugi and Coraline sat together on a bench outside the mission chapel. The other children had gone inside for their evening meal, but neither of them felt hungry. Too much had changed too quickly. What should I call you? Coraline asked after a long silence. If you're going to be my guardian? Deklugi considered this. Among my people, different relationships have different names. But I think in the white man's world, the closest word would be father. If that does not feel wrong to you. Coraline tested the word silently in her mind. Father. She had not had a father since she was 4 years old, when her own had abandoned her and her mother to chase dreams of gold in California. The word felt both strange and right at the same time. I would like that, she said finally. To have a father again. Even if some people think it's strange. Strange, Deklugi repeated with a slight smile. Yes, it will certainly be that. An Apache father and a white daughter. The gossips will have much to say. But let them talk. We will know the truth of what we are to each other, and that is all that matters. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Inside the mission, someone began to play a piano, and the sound of children's voices rose in an evening hymn. It was a sound of peace, of safety, of home 2 months later. When spring had fully claimed the territory and the trial had concluded with convictions for all 17 defendants, Deklugi stood before a territorial judge in a small courtroom in the capital. Beside him stood Coraline, wearing a new dress that Sister Margaret had sewn for the occasion. Behind them sat Sister Margaret herself, along with Captain Reynolds of the cavalry, the territorial governor, and others prepared to testify to Deklugi's character. The judge, a severe man with silver hair and steel-rimmed spectacles, reviewed the petition before him with an expression that gave away nothing. This is highly irregular, he said finally. I can find no precedent for what you are requesting. Then we will establish a precedent, Sister Margaret said from her seat, her voice carrying clearly. This child and this man have proven themselves worthy of each other. They have survived trials that would have broken most people. They have brought criminals to justice and demonstrated courage beyond measure. If our laws cannot recognize such a bond, then perhaps our laws need to change. The judge looked at her over his spectacles. You are out of order, Sister Margaret. I am often out of order, Your Honor, she replied without apology. Usually when order serves injustice, the judge's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. He returned his attention to the petition. Daklugi, do you understand the responsibilities you would be taking on? This child would become your legal dependent. You would be responsible for her care, her education, her welfare in all things. I understand, Daklugi said. And I accept these responsibilities willingly. The judge looked at Coraline. And you, child? Do you wish this man to become your legal guardian? Coraline stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. Yes, Your Honor. He saved my life. He protected me when no one else would. He taught me to be brave. I want him to be my father. The courtroom was utterly silent. The judge set down the petition and removed his spectacles, cleaning them slowly with a handkerchief. When he replaced them, his expression had softened almost imperceptibly. Against my better judgment, and in recognition of the extraordinary circumstances of this case, I am approving this petition. Daklugi, you are hereby named legal guardian of the minor child Coraline Webb, with all rights and responsibilities that entails. May God grant you both the wisdom to navigate the difficult path ahead. He brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through eternity. Coraline threw her arms around Daklugi, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she felt truly safe. Not just protected, but belonging somewhere, to someone. They walked out of the courthouse together into bright sunlight, ready to begin the strange and wonderful journey of becoming a family. Behind them, Sister Margaret smiled her rare smile, knowing she had witnessed something remarkable. Justice served, a child saved, and love recognized where the world said it could not exist. The truth had won, and in winning, had transformed them all.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.